All right, close your eyes for just a second. I want you to imagine the bustling, seriously opulent streets of medieval Baghdad. We're talking, what, 1200 years ago? The air is just thick with the scent of spices from the Far East. You're hearing dozens of different languages blending in these incredibly vibrant markets. And the architectural grandeur? Unmatched. This was one of the absolute largest and wealthiest cities in the entire world, literally the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. And sitting right at the center of this vast, thriving metropolis was one man, ruling an empire stretching all the way from the shores of North Africa right to the borders of Central Asia. So in today's Explainer, we're going to uncover the gritty reality behind the life, the conquests, and the honestly unparalleled intellectual legacy of the Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because, well, when most people hear the name Harun al-Rashid, their minds immediately jump straight to folklore, right? You might actually know him as that whimsical, almost mythological ruler who wanders the streets of Baghdad in disguise. You know, the guy famously featured in the legendary tales of the 1001 Nights. But we really need to ask ourselves, was he just some character out of a storybook? Because the actual historical sources, they reveal a high-stakes reality that is way more fascinating and, honestly, a lot more ruthless than any fairy tale.
You see, we usually picture the myth, right? This romanticized patron of the arts just relaxing and listening to Scheherazad's enchanting stories. But the gritty, historical truth, it's entirely different. Harun al-Rashid was a highly brilliant military commander, a master geopolitical strategist. He wasn't just sitting back enjoying all that wealth. He was out there, actively crushing rebellions, fighting off religious schisms, and micromanaging a highly complex inter-regional trade network. And that network literally decided the material fate of the surrounding empires. He was a guy who had to somehow balance this immense cultural flourishing with absolute and sometimes brutally strict political control.
So meet the actual man behind the myth, Harun al-Rashid, the fifth Abbasid Caliph. He was born around 766 CE in Rai, which is up in modern-day northern Iran, the son of Caliph al-Mahdi. It's kind of wild to think that this one guy would eventually ascend to rule a literal global superpower. I mean, his empire commanded the major trade routes of the known world. We're talking the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the eastern provinces bordering Turkestan. He essentially held the master keys to global commerce.
And the pace of his early life, honestly, it's breathless. So he's born in 766, right? By the time he's a teenager, in 780, he is already named the commander of military expeditions against the Byzantine Greek Empire. Just picture that for a second. Being a teenager and leading an army that penetrated all the way to the shores of the Bosporus, staring right across at Constantinople. Now sure, he was guided by seasoned generals, but these early campaigns totally forged his strategic mindset. He was rewarded with governorships over places like Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And then, after the sudden and honestly pretty mysterious death of his older brother al-Hadi, Harun ascends to the absolute peak of power in 786. He was only 20 years old.
But let's be real, a 20-year-old doesn't just take over a massive, volatile empire all by himself. His rapid rise was orchestrated through some incredibly brilliant political maneuvering by the real power behind the throne, namely his mother, El-Khayzuran. She was actually a former slave who rose to immense influence, and she worked tirelessly to secure his spot. And crucially, Harun leaned heavily on his former tutor and secretarial aide, Yahya the Barmakid. The Barmakids were this wildly powerful Persian family. Their ancestors had actually been administrators of an influential Buddhist monastery in Afghanistan before the Islamic conquests. So as soon as Harun becomes caliph, he makes Yahya his vizier, basically his prime minister, giving the administration of this vast empire over to some incredibly capable hands.
To really grasp Harun's geopolitical weight, we've got to zoom out to the global stage. If we compare the Abbasid Caliphates to its biggest contemporary in the West, the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, the contrast is honestly staggering. We hear a lot about Charlemagne in Western history classes, sure, but look at the scale of global influence here. Harun controlled this vast, sophisticated network that basically decided the fate of world trade from the Far East all the way to the Mediterranean. In the geopolitical framework of that specific time, Charlemagne's newly restored Roman Empire in the West was actually considered pretty peripheral. Harun was the true heavyweight. He held sway over a much more advanced and economically powerful domain.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how these two entirely distinct worlds interacted. Because despite their obvious differences, Charlemagne and Harun actually engaged in diplomatic missions. And this completely subverts our modern expectations about medieval Christian-Muslim relations. Get this, Harun actually sent Charlemagne a breathtaking gift, an actual elephant named Abu al-Abbas, along with these magnificent carved ivory tusks. Can you imagine? This incredible animal just lived out its days at the Carolingian court in Europe. It's such a colorful, humanizing little anecdote, but it also really shows us that political interests and trade could easily override religious and cultural differences. Both these rulers wanted mutual recognition just to counter their shared rival, the Byzantine Empire.
But hey, while Harun was busy sending elephants to the west, he was demonstrating absolute military ferocity in the east. Those early teenage experiences fighting the Byzantines definitely stuck with him. He went and created a special military province to fortify the Islamic Christian border, specifically at Tarsus. At one point, the Byzantine Empress Irene tried to secure peace, and he literally forced her to pay a heavy tribute. And when her successor, Emperor Nikephoros, boldly decided to stop those payments and attack, Harun vigorously repulsed him. He marched his army deep into Asia Minor, menaced Constantinople itself, and forced this humiliating peace treaty with a massive annual tribute in 806. Under his watch, Arab naval forces even recaptured the island of Cyprus. The guy was an uncompromising defender of his borders.
All right, let's transition to what is undoubtedly the absolute climax of his reign, the crown jewel of Baghdad, the Beit al-Hikmah, or as it's better known, the House of Wisdom. Now, Harun al-Rashid initially built this as a magnificent library, the Khazanat al-Hikmah, just to house the rare manuscripts collected by his father and grandfather. But oh man, it quickly grew into so much more. It transformed Baghdad into the intellectual heartbeat of the entire world. This wasn't just a building, it was a sprawling, buzzing academy of knowledge that attracted the absolute greatest minds of the era from far and wide.
The staggering diversity of the fields they studied here was totally unprecedented. We're talking groundbreaking work in mathematics, literally laying the very foundations of algebra, advanced astronomy, medicine, zoology, alchemy, and chemistry. Plus, it was the epicenter of this massive, history-altering translation movement. Scholars were in there furiously translating ancient Greek, Farsi, Aramaic, and Syriac texts straight into Arabic. And the truly beautiful part? People flocked to this academy regardless of their background. You had Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars, both male and female, all working side by side in this incredible powerhouse of intellect. 500. For roughly 500 years, Baghdad boasted this unmatched intellectual supremacy, and it was heavily fueled by the staggering wealth of the Abbasid Caliphs. To give you an idea of just how much they valued knowledge, Harun's son, Caliph al-Mamun, who later vastly expanded the House of Wisdom, was known to encourage his top translators by literally paying them the weight of their completed books in solid gold. No joke, just imagine that. Knowledge was quite literally worth its weight in gold.
And this brilliantly illustrates why this specific era matters so incredibly much to us today. The Great Translation movement didn't just passively save ancient texts from figures like Aristotle and Hippocrates from fading into oblivion. No, it was a foundry for original scientific advancement. These Arab scientists weren't just simple copyists, they were pioneers. They were doing theory and experimentation hundreds of years before the scientific revolution ever kicked off in Europe. The knowledge that they refined and expanded in Baghdad's House of Wisdom would eventually filter its way up into Europe, fundamentally sparking the European Renaissance. But, the dazzling light of Baghdad's golden age also casts some pretty deep shadows. So let's pivot for a second to the darker tragedy of Harun's reign. Remember the Barmakid family, his vizier Yahya, and his highly capable sons, Al-Fadl and Jafar, the guys who basically ran the empire for 17 years? Well, by the year 803, they had become simply way too powerful. Harun, who was already finding it really difficult to hold his vast, rebellious empire together, grew incredibly paranoid. And suddenly, in this brutal overnight purge, the Barmakids were stripped of all their lands and thrown in prison. Jafar was even executed. It was a terrifyingly swift fall from grace.
And this purge wasn't just some standard political reshuffling. Historical accounts, like this one from Story 67, reveal a deeply personal tragedy. See, even when he was warned that Harun was actively plotting against his life, Jafar maintained his absolute loyalty. He reportedly said, "By the God of the Kaaba, if Harun al-Rashid ordered my dismemberment and crushed me into little pieces, I would still not forget the good things he has done for me, nor would I ever betray him." I mean, wow. It's a chilling reminder of the intense dedication of his administrators, guys doomed by the relentless paranoia of a ruler desperately clinging to control.
And that desperation to maintain control, that ultimately led to Harun's single biggest mistake. Knowing his empire was starting to fracture, he created what's known as the Covenant of the Kaaba. Honestly, it was a disastrous succession plan. He basically declared that his firstborn, Al-Amin, would be caliph in Baghdad.
Then, his next son, Al-Mamun, would get full autonomous power over the eastern Iranian provinces, and a third son, Al-Mu'tasim, would control Mesopotamia. Harun genuinely thought dividing these responsibilities would somehow prevent conflict, but in reality, he essentially just drew the battle lines for a massive bloody civil war.
But Harun would never actually see the fallout of his flawed plan. In 809, while leading an expedition to put down yet another revolt, this time in eastern Persia, Harun al-Rashid died at Tus. And almost immediately after his death, the exact thing he tried to prevent came to pass. Al-Amin tried to strip Al-Mamun of his rights, and boom, the Abbasid Empire plunged right into a devastating civil war. A war that permanently weakened the political ascendancy of the Caliphate. Those eastern provinces? They would soon break away entirely into autonomous dynasties.
So, the crucial point we need to take away is this. Harun al-Rashid's legacy is one of profound duality. On the one hand, his political and military state ultimately fractured. His terrible succession plan cost the institution of the Caliphate a very high price, really paving the way for its eventual decline. But on the exact same token, he left behind an absolutely indestructible intellectual legacy. The House of Wisdom he founded didn't just die with his empire. It continued to thrive, to translate, and to make mind-blowing discoveries for centuries, forever cementing the Islamic Golden Age.
Which brings us to our final and honestly perhaps most important question. If Harun al-Rashid's political empire ultimately fractured and faded away, how much of our modern world, our mathematics, our modern medicine, our philosophy, was actually built upon the ancient texts that he and his scholars saved, translated, and improved upon? It's just incredible to think that a caliph who spent his life fighting Byzantine armies and navigating deadly court politics also managed to lay the intellectual groundwork for the world we live in today. I mean, it really makes you want to dig a little deeper into the shelves of that legendary House of Wisdom, doesn't it?